around 6 in the evening, the air in the townhouse felt too expensive to breathe. It carried the scent of fresh lilies and polish, and something sharper underneath like metal warmed by skin. Every surface around me was glossy and cold, marble under my bare feet, mirror framed in gold. A chandelier above that threw light down in perfect, cruel sparkles, like the house was dressed for a celebration it didn't believe in. I stood in front of the vanity in a dress that wasn't mine. Not really. It had been tailored to fit my body, but it didn't belong to my life. The bodice hugged my ribs so tight I had to take shallow breaths, like I was hiding instead of getting married. My hands were steady when I brushed on lip color. They were not steady when I reached for the necklace. A soft knock came at the door. A stylist, a maid, someone with a careful face and careful eyes. I didn't need to hear words to understand what they wanted from me. Sit still, smile, let them finish turning me into something presentable. I nodded, because nodding was safer than speaking. Downstairs, in a sitting room that might as well have been another universe, my son was waiting with a nanny I barely knew. Evan. 7 years old. All elbows and curiosity and that bright, stubborn kindness that made strangers talk to him like he was a small miracle. He'd been excited about today in the innocent way only a child can be. He'd asked if my dress would be sparkly. He'd asked if there would be cake. He'd asked if the man I was marrying would like dinosaurs, because Evan had decided that was the most important compatibility question in the world. I had kissed his forehead and told him everything would be fine. That lie sat in my throat now, heavy as a stone. I wasn't supposed to be wandering the second-floor hallway in my wedding dress. Not with my hair pinned up and my makeup perfect and my stomach turning like I'd swallowed ice water. I was supposed to be in the bridal suite, surrounded by women fluffing tulle and making nervous jokes. But I'd needed air. And I'd needed to know where Evan was. And I'd needed God help me to remind myself I was still a person with choices, even if none of my choices felt real anymore. The hallway outside the suite was quiet in that rich house way. No sounds of traffic. No neighbor's TV, just the muffled movement of staff and the far-off vibration of music being tested downstairs. As I passed a study door half open at the end of the corridor, I heard a voice I recognized without ever really knowing it. Damian Crowe's voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It carried like it owned the air. I stopped because my body stopped. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept me alive through the last few years. Through an ex who disappeared when responsibility showed up. Through a father who smiled while he calculated my worth. Through late nights juggling bills and bedtime stories and the kind of fear you don't admit out loud because then it becomes real. I hadn't meant to listen. I hadn't planned on it. But the first few words lodged under my skin and wouldn't let go. He was talking about me. Not as a bride. Not as a woman. Not as the person standing a few feet away in a dress that cost more than my car. As a decision. As a move. As a lever. My mind tried to reject it at first. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe I was mishearing. Maybe he was talking about something else, someone else. But then there was another voice, older, rougher, loyal in that way men get when they attach themselves to power. Ray Maddox, his right-hand man. I'd seen Ray once during the arrangement meeting, standing behind Damian like a shadow that could bite. The words that followed weren't romantic. They weren't even cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. They were colder than that, practical, measured. The language of men who negotiate lives the way other people negotiate rent. In the space of a few seconds, I understood something with a clarity that made my vision blur. Damian didn't want me. This marriage wasn't a story. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't even a sacrifice for love or family. It was a strategy. My chest tightened. The air felt thin. I pressed my palm to the wall like it could hold me up. I heard my name, Claire Bennett, spoken the way you'd read it on a contract. And then, like the universe was determined to twist the knife, I heard Evan's name too. Not with warmth, not with gentleness, with hesitation, with the tone people use when they talk about a problem they didn't plan for. A complication, something that needed to be handled, managed. The word didn't have to be said exactly that way for me to feel it. It was there in the pause, in the slight shift of the conversation, in the way it turned from territory and ports and alliances to a child who didn't know any of this existed. My son was 7. He still believed adults fix things. He still believed promises meant something. He still reached for my hand in crowded spaces without feeling ashamed. And in that room, behind that door, he was being reduced to an obstacle. I swallowed hard and tasted the beginning of tears. I could have turned and walked away. I could have forced myself back into the bridal suite and let the stylists pin my veil and pretend I didn't hear anything. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. but my feet stayed planted, because I needed to know what kind of cage I was stepping into. And because if someone was planning to manage my child, I needed to know how far they'd go. Damian's voice dipped lower. It took on that final edge I'd heard in the arrangement meeting the tone of a man used to being obeyed. He spoke about security and public perception and risk. He spoke about keeping threats away from the house, from the family name, from me. It would have been almost comforting if I didn't know what he'd said first. If I didn't know I was an asset being protected because assets were useful. Ray asked some practical detail about timing, about how soon everything could be consolidated. Damian answered like this was a simple math problem. And then, almost casually, he spoke about what my father controlled, what I brought, what this alliance locked down, like I was a shipping lane with a pulse. My throat burned. I blinked hard, but it didn't help. Because the worst part wasn't that he didn't want me. The worst part wasn't even that he could say it so calmly. The worst part was that he was right. Not morally, not emotionally, but strategically. I was the daughter of Frank Bennett. My father had spent years building his own kind of power, quiet, profitable, the kind that didn't make headlines. He controlled access to certain routes, certain contacts, certain doors in the city that didn't open for most people. And he'd used me as currency to settle his debts and secure his position. I already knew that. Hearing Damian confirm it, like he was checking a box, made something inside me go still. A final sound drifted from the room, Ray moving, maybe closing a folder, maybe shifting his weight. Then the conversation changed, flowing into details that didn't matter. And I realized if I stayed another second, I might actually break. I backed away without meaning to. My heel caught on the edge of a runner and I stumbled, the fabric of my dress whispering too loud in the quiet hallway. My heart hammered as if someone had fired a gun. No one came out. No one called my name. I slid into a nearby powder room and locked the door with shaking hands. The click sounded like a verdict. I stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror looked composed, dark hair pinned in a smooth twist, eyes lined perfectly, lips steady. She looked like someone who belonged in this house. I didn't. My hands gripped the edge of the sink. I breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, the way I'd learned to do when Evan had nightmares and I needed to be calm enough to pull him back from them. I thought about going downstairs to him, scooping him up and leaving, running into the city and disappearing into a life where no one knew my name. Then I remembered the other truth about men like Damian Crowe. There was no disappearing. There was only obedience, or consequences. I wiped my eyes before the tears could ruin the careful makeup. I lifted my chin. I practiced a smile that didn't reach my heart, because this was the part my mother never taught me and my father never cared about. Surviving isn't just staying alive. Sometimes it's keeping your face steady while someone signs your future away. When I stepped back into the hallway, the noise from downstairs had grown louder. Guests arriving, glasses clinking, music swelling. My body moved on autopilot, the way it does when you've spent years doing what needs to be done, even when your emotions are screaming. Somewhere down there, Evan was waiting, and I had promised him everything would be fine. I walked toward the staircase like a woman walking toward a cliff. Just after 7, the townhouse was full. People in black suits with earpieces stood at every corner, pretending they were part of the decor. Women glittered in diamonds and smiles that didn't touch their eyes. Someone laughed too loudly near the bar, a sound meant to signal comfort. I noticed exits. I noticed sightlines. I noticed the way the staff moved fast but avoided eye contact. I noticed, with a sick kind of clarity, how normal this was for them. When I reached the landing, I saw Evan across the room. He was sitting on a velvet chair near the nanny, swinging his feet too high above the floor. He wore a tiny suit that made him look like he was playing dress-up, and his hair had been combed neatly, though one cowlick still fought for freedom near his temple. His eyes found mine and his whole face lit up. For a second, my chest cracked open. I held his gaze and smiled. And it was the only real thing I'd done all day. I wanted to go to him. I wanted to kneel and fix his tie and whisper that none of this mattered, that we would leave, that he was my real life. But my father appeared at my side before I could move. Frank Bennett looked proud, like he'd just closed the deal of his career. His tux fit him well. His hair was slicked back. His smile was practiced. He offered me his arm, a gesture that would look tender to anyone watching. It wasn't tenderness. It was control. I slid my hand through the crook of his elbow because the room was watching, and because I'd learned young what happened when you embarrassed a man who cared about appearances. He leaned close, his voice low enough that it sounded intimate. It wasn't. He reminded me to keep my face calm. He reminded me this was bigger than feelings. He reminded me that I was lucky. Lucky. The word tasted like dust. I glanced at Evan again. The nanny gave me a small nod. Evan waved with both hands, like this was the best day of his life. My stomach turned. And then, the doors opened. The ceremony space was gorgeous in the way money makes things gorgeous. White flowers, candlelight, fabric draped so perfectly it looked like it had never been touched by human hands. A string quartet played something soft and elegant, like the sound could smooth over the truth of what was happening. I walked down the aisle with my father's hand on my arm and my spine held straight by sheer stubbornness. At the front stood Damian Crowe. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who didn't have to move much to take up space. His hair was dark and neat. His suit fit him like it had been designed around him, not the other way around. His face was controlled, calm, expression carved into something that might have been handsome if it didn't feel like a warning. When his eyes met mine, they didn't soften. They assessed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was the look you give a door you're about to lock. And I realized, standing there in front of everyone, that the rejection I overheard wasn't just humiliation. It was a map. This marriage would not be about love. It would not be about partnership. Not yet. It would be about ownership. The officiant's words blurred together. I heard my own voice responding when I was supposed to respond. I felt Damian's hand take mine. His fingers were cool, steady, firm in a way that felt practiced. When the ring slid onto my finger, it felt heavier than it should have. The kiss that followed was brief, controlled. It didn't taste like romance. It tasted like obligation and champagne and the faint bite of peppermint. Applause erupted. Someone cheered. Cameras flashed. I smiled because that was what a bride did. Inside, I felt hollow. The reception moved like a dream I couldn't wake up from. I shook hands. I accepted congratulations. I listened to people talk about the future and stability and new beginnings with bright, empty voices. I watched Damian drift from group to group like he was hosting a business conference instead of his wedding. Men leaned in close to him. Hands clasped. Nods exchanged. Deals made in the space between sips of expensive liquor. I didn't belong in that world, but I was attached to it now. Evan disappeared at some point, guided upstairs by the nanny because children weren't meant to be part of the late-night part of this kind of celebration. I watched him go, his small hand holding hers, his head turning back to look for me. I smiled. I waved. My heart broke in silence. Damian barely looked at me. When he did, it wasn't the gaze of a man in love. It was the gaze of a man checking the room, making sure the performance stayed intact. My father stayed close, like he was guarding his investment. At some point, someone made a toast about family. People laughed. Someone joked about heirs and legacies in a way that made my skin crawl. I felt my mouth curve into another practiced smile while my fingers tightened around my glass. I wasn't naive. I hadn't expected fairy tales, but I had expected one thing I now realized I might never get: respect. And that thought was the one that finally sharpened my numbness into anger. Because I had survived too much to be reduced to someone else's breeding plan. A little after midnight, the townhouse shifted. The guests grew louder, looser. The lights softened. The staff moved with faster urgency, clearing space, guiding people, corralling chaos into something that still looked elegant. And then someone touched my elbow gently, Ray Maddox, the right-hand man, appearing like he'd been summoned by the house itself. He didn't speak to me like a friend. He didn't speak to me like a family member. He spoke to me like a schedule. I understood without words that it was time to go upstairs. Time for the final part of the performance. The part everyone pretended not to watch while still expecting proof it happened. My legs felt heavy as I climbed the stairs. The master suite was at the end of a long hallway. The carpet muffled sound. The air was cooler up here, cleaner. Like the house kept its emotions on the first floor and saved this floor for decisions. The door closed behind me with a soft click. Damian was already there. He loosened his ties slowly, methodically, like he was winding down from a long day at work. He poured himself a drink without asking if I wanted one. He didn't touch me. He didn't approach me. In the silence, I realized something else. Distance was not an accident. It was his choice. He moved to a chair near the window and sat. His posture relaxed in a way that didn't feel relaxed at all. His eyes flicked to me once, then away, like looking too long might cost him something. I waited. I didn't know what for. Permission, instructions, a sign that he might behave like a human being. Instead, he made a small gesture toward an adjoining room, the guest bedroom, the implication clear. I could take it if I wanted. The offer might have sounded generous to someone else. To me, it sounded like avoidance, and something fierce rose in me. Not desire, not romance, defiance, because I had already heard what he thought of me. I had already felt the sting of being treated like a strategic purchase. If he wanted to keep me at arm's length to protect himself, fine. But he wasn't going to make me feel like I was the one begging for space. I walked past him to the dresser and began unpinning my earrings, my fingers steadier now than they'd been all day. The dress felt heavier with every breath. My shoulders ached from holding myself upright. The silence stretched. I knew what the expectations were. I knew what the contract implied, even if it didn't say the words in ink. In Damian's world, marriage meant duty, legacy, control, and I'd already been warned that my child was a complication. I turned slightly, not facing him fully, because some part of me refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing how shaken I still was. I moved toward the bed and sat on the edge, the fabric of my dress pooling around me like a tide. I wasn't doing this because I wanted him. I was doing it because I refused to be treated like an object that had no agency. If I was stepping into a cage, I was going to decide how I stood inside it. The night unfolded in a way that felt almost clinical. Efficient, controlled, no cruelty, not exactly just absence. Like he was present physically while his mind stayed locked somewhere far away. After, I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet of the house, feeling the weight of the ring on my finger like a shackle. Damian moved away from me, creating space so quickly it felt practiced. He didn't hold me. He didn't say anything that softened the moment. He didn't even look relieved. He looked distant, like he'd done what had to be done, and now he could return to being himself. I turned my face into the pillow and breathed through the ache in my chest, telling myself it didn't matter, telling myself I could handle anything as long as Evan was safe. That was when I remembered the folder I'd seen earlier in the day. The contract. My father had pushed it toward me with a pen like it was just paperwork, like it wasn't my life. I had signed because I'd been trapped, because my father had promised this would protect Evan, because he'd promised Damian's name would keep enemies away. But I hadn't read every page, not carefully enough. Now, in the dead quiet of the master suite, I slid out of bed and moved toward the small desk near the wall. The folder sat there, neat, waiting, a ribbon tied around it like a gift. My hands shook as I opened it. Page after page, legal language, cold phrasing, clauses that sounded harmless until you understood what men like Damian could do with them. Then I found it. A section about relocation, education, guardianship. Not written as if Evan was my child. Written as if Evan was a dependent attached to an asset. Terms about where he would attend school. Who would approve the school. What neighborhood was acceptable. How security would be handled. Who would have access to him. And then, the line that made my vision go sharp and my stomach drop. A contingency clause. If something happened to me, if I was deemed unfit, unstable, unsafe, custodial authority could shift, not automatically to my father, not automatically to anyone I loved, to the household, to Damian's appointed guardian, to Damian's world. I pressed my fingers to the paper so hard my knuckles went white. This wasn't just marriage. This was a takeover. This was a man I barely knew holding the legal shape of my child's future in his hands. I stood there in the dim light, the townhouse silent around me, and for the first time that day, the humiliation drained away and left something colder in its place. Fear. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind that settles into your bones and starts rewriting your instincts. Behind me, the bed creaked softly, Damian shifting, breathing, existing. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Because if I looked at him right then, I might scream, or I might beg, and both would be mistakes. I closed the folder carefully, like closing it too fast might make the truth explode. Then I stood very still, listening to the house, listening to the security on the doors, listening to the silence that was about to become my new normal. Somewhere in this place, my son was asleep in a room chosen for him by people who called him a complication, and I understood with awful clarity that the real prison wasn't the ceremony downstairs. It wasn't even the bed behind me. It was the days that would come after this, the separate wings, the cameras, the rules I hadn't learned yet. It was waking up every morning in a house that could take my child from me with a signature. I walked back to the bed and lay down carefully, facing the edge, staring into the dark. Around 1 a.m, the townhouse felt like it had swallowed me whole. And I knew tomorrow wouldn't be easier. Tomorrow would be the first day of my sentence. 3 months later, I learned the quiet can be louder than gunfire. The townhouse didn't change. The marble stayed polished. The air stayed filtered. The staff still moved like ghosts who knew how to disappear the moment you looked at them. But I changed. Evan changed. And the space between me and Damian, it didn't shrink. It hardened. By late morning most days, the sun would pour through the tall windows in the south-facing rooms, turning the dust into floating glitter. It would have been beautiful if it didn't feel like a spotlight in a cage. Damian kept the west wing. I kept the east. Somewhere between us was a hallway that felt like an international border. We crossed it only when we had to, when there was a dinner with donors, a family event, a polite appearance that reminded the city what name I carried now. In public, we played our roles. I learned how to stand beside him without leaning in, how to smile without warmth, how to let his hand rest at my back like a claim while my mind stayed separate, like I was watching myself from above. Then we'd return home and split again, each of us retreating to our side like the performance had drained whatever humanity we had left. At night, I'd lie in a bed that still smelled faintly of him and stare at the ceiling, listening for the sounds of the house. Sometimes I'd hear his footsteps far away, measured and steady. Sometimes I'd hear nothing at all, and wonder if he slept at all, or if men like him ever really rested. Evan adapted faster than I wanted him to. That was the first thing that scared me. In the first weeks, he asked questions the way kids do, innocent, relentless, and hopeful. He wanted to know why there were guards outside the kitchen. He wanted to know why the nanny walked him to the bathroom like he might get lost in a house that could fit 3 families inside it. He wanted to know why I had to tell someone when we wanted to go to the garden. I answered the way I always had, carefully, gently. I tried to make it sound temporary, like we were just visiting. But children are smarter than adults give them credit for. They don't always understand the details, but they understand the feeling. By the end of the first month, Evan stopped asking why. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a loss. He learned to lower his voice around the guards. Not because anyone told him to, but because he sensed that voices carried in this house. He learned to scan a room before he ran into it, the way I used to scan a parking lot at night when I was a single mom walking to my car with groceries and no one to call if something went wrong. He started watching doors. Not like he was curious, like he was checking. Sometimes he'd look at me before he spoke, like he was measuring whether it was safe to say what he wanted to say. I'd catch him studying the men in suits the way he used to study big dogs, respectful, cautious, still trying to believe they wouldn't bite. And I would smile and keep my voice soft and tell myself he was fine. Then I'd go into the bathroom and lock the door and feel my chest tighten until it hurt. Because the contract clause I'd found that first night lived in the back of my mind like a constant hum. Schooling, relocation, guardianship, the legal language that turned my child into a dependent attached to a deal. There were moments, small, warm moments, when I could almost pretend we had a life. Evan loved the kitchen because it was the only place that felt human. The cook, a kind older woman named Mrs. Halpern, would slip him extra chocolate chips when she made cookies. Evan would stand on a stool and stir batter with an intensity that made him look like he was defusing a bomb. Flour would dust his nose. He'd grin at me like we were just 2 people in a normal home. Those minutes were oxygen. Then a guard would step into the doorway to check the hallway, and the air would change. The house always reminded us who owned it. To survive, I built routines like a fortress. Every morning around 7, I made Evan breakfast myself, no matter what the staff offered. I packed his little backpack even though he wasn't going to a regular school yet. Damian's people were still vetting options. That phrase was another kind of cage, something that sounded responsible but tasted like control. Around 9, I carved out learning time with Evan. Books, math worksheets, art projects. I made it sound fun, but it was also a way to keep him anchored, proof that his world still had rules that made sense. By late morning, I left the townhouse for charity work. That became my lifeline. If I stayed inside too long, the walls started to feel like they were closing in. The quiet started to press on my skin. The anger started to turn into something heavier, something darker. So I threw myself into work that felt real. I helped at a women's shelter in Queens. I sat with mothers who had nothing but the clothes on their backs and still managed to braid their daughter's hair with tenderness. I organized donations for foster kids who bounced from house to house without ever unpacking. I worked on scholarship programs for single moms trying to finish school. It was messy, loud, human. It reminded me I was still Claire Bennett, not just Claire Crowe. And it reminded me why I couldn't let this world swallow Evan whole. Damian didn't come with me. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't praise or forbid it outright. Instead, his presence hovered around me like smoke. It arrived through Ray Maddox. Ray would appear in my wing with the timing of a metronome, always at the edge of my space, never fully entering unless invited. He didn't look at the artwork I hung on the walls. He didn't comment on Evan's drawings taped to the fridge. He delivered information the way a man delivers weather reports. The boss wanted to confirm my schedule. The boss had arranged additional security for my route. The boss had approved a donation. The boss had noticed I'd been taking Evan to the garden later in the afternoon. Every time I heard that phrasing, the boss noticed I felt my back stiffen. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed what I didn't want to admit. I was being observed. It wasn't just the guards at the doors. It wasn't just the driver who seemed to know which streets to avoid without me asking. It wasn't just the staff who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, like the house itself was tracking my movement. It was the feeling that my life had become a report. One afternoon around 2, I walked Evan back from the small indoor playroom they'd set up for him in the East Wing. It was a beautiful room, soft rug, toy bins, bookshelves. It should have felt like a gift. Instead, it felt staged, like someone had built a replica of childhood inside a fortress and expected that to be enough. Evan chattered about a dinosaur book, hands waving, voice bright. I listened, smiling, holding onto the sound like it was a rope. Then, just as we stepped into the hallway outside the playroom, I saw it. A small black dome tucked into the corner near the ceiling. At first, my brain tried to dismiss it. Maybe it had always been there. Maybe I'd just never looked up. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I looked down the hallway. Another dome. Slightly farther. Angled toward the doors. I looked toward the staircase. One more. My skin prickled. Evan tugged my hand, impatient to show me something he'd drawn. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and he didn't want to ask. That was the worst part at 7 years old. He was already learning what questions were dangerous. I guided him back into my sitting room and handed him crayons, telling myself to stay calm. My mouth moved, making soft, normal sounds. My body sat on the couch like nothing was wrong. Inside, something cracked. Because those cameras weren't for art theft. They weren't for household management. They were angled toward the spaces where my child moved. I waited until Evan was absorbed in his drawing. Then I walked back into the hallway alone. I stared up at the dome camera until my eyes ached. A part of me wanted to rip it down with my bare hands. Another part of me whispered something that made me nauseous. The cameras weren't just watching Evan to protect him. They were watching him because he mattered. And in this world, anything that mattered could be used. I turned, walked back into my room, and sat behind Evan so he couldn't see my face. My anger came in waves. It wasn't just the invasion. It was the hypocrisy. Damian had acted like he didn't want me, like I was a business problem he had to solve. Yet his house watched me like I was the center of its security system. Why would a man who claimed I was nothing more than leverage need eyes on me at all times? Why would he track the way my child moved through a hallway? That question followed me for days like a shadow. It made me notice patterns. The way the guards changed shifts precisely when I left the house. The way a second vehicle always seemed to appear a block away when Evan and I went to a park. The way the staff's behavior shifted after I mentioned something casually like a preference for chamomile tea, only to find a fresh tin of it on my counter the next day. Little things. Protective things. Control disguised as care. I hated it. And I couldn't stop noticing it. The confusion was almost worse than the anger. Because confusion makes you doubt your own instincts. It makes you second-guess everything. Around 1 p.m. on a Thursday, I met Maya Torres for lunch. The restaurant was in a neutral part of the city, upscale but not flashy. The kind of place where politicians and business people blended into the crowd. The kind of place with soft lighting and white tablecloths and waiters who knew how to pretend they didn't hear anything. Maya was already seated, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp. She looked like she belonged anywhere and trusted no one fully, which was exactly why she was one of the only people I trusted. She took one look at me and her expression changed, like she was reading something under my skin. I sat down across from her. Wrapping my fingers around the glass of water the waiter set down. My hands were steady. My insides weren't. I told her the truth the way you confess something you've been holding too long. Not as a dramatic speech, as a series of small, ugly facts. How I'd overheard Damian before the wedding. How I'd heard my own value reduced to strategy. How I'd heard Evan mentioned like an inconvenience. How the marriage felt like a prison that smelled like expensive soap. How Damian lived in another wing like I was contagious. How the cameras appeared near Evan's playroom. Maya listened without interrupting. Her gaze locked on mine, her mouth tightening in that way it did when she got angry but didn't want to waste the anger. When I finally paused, it felt like I'd been holding my breath for 3 months and had only just exhaled. Maya's response didn't come out as comfort. It came out as clarity. She had this way of stripping a situation down until all the excuses fell off. She made me feel, without saying it directly, that I was giving Damian too much power over my interpretation of reality. That men like him used words as shields and actions as weapons. The point wasn't what he said in a private room. The point was what he did every day after. I stared at the condensation on my water glass and felt my throat tighten again. Because if I was honest, the things he did were not the things of a man who didn't care. They were the things of a man guarding something he couldn't afford to lose. That thought was dangerous. It sounded too close to hope, and hope was the one thing I couldn't afford in a house like his. Maya shifted the conversation without letting me hide. She told me about rumors she'd heard, quiet whispers moving through certain circles. The Vescari crew had been buying influence, pressuring people, making moves that didn't look like small business expansions, moves that looked like preparation. I felt cold spread through my stomach. In my mind, I saw the black domes in my hallway again. The extra guards, the careful routes, the way my driver never stopped at red lights unless he had to. Protection wasn't just paranoia. Protection meant there was something to protect against. I tried to steady myself by focusing on small things. The clink of silverware, the soft hum of conversation around us, the smell of garlic and wine drifting from the kitchen. But my body didn't care about ambiance. My body cared about threats. By the time lunch ended, I felt like my skin was too tight over my bones. Maya reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly, grounding me in a way that made my eyes burn. I left the restaurant around 3 in the afternoon with my heart beating a little too fast for no reason I could name. Outside, the city was bright and ordinary. Traffic moved. People laughed on sidewalks. A man walked a dog that looked like it had never known fear. My driver, Marcus, held the back door open for me. Marcus was one of Damian's men. He'd been assigned to me since the wedding. He was polite in the way trained men are. Polite, respectful, attentive, never familiar. I slid into the back seat and watched the restaurant disappear behind us as we pulled into traffic. For 2 blocks, everything felt normal enough that my mind tried to relax. Then I saw it. A black SUV behind us, keeping just the right distance. Not too close, not too far. Tinted windows. No visible plates from this angle. My stomach dropped in a way I recognized. That wasn't anxiety. That was instinct. I leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't need to say anything for me to understand that he saw it too. The car behind us took the same turns we took. It didn't drift away. It didn't get stuck at lights. It moved with us like it was attached by a wire. My pulse hammered. My palms dampened against my dress. The world outside the window started to look sharper, like my brain was cataloging everything for evidence. Street signs, alleyways, gaps between cars. A pedestrian who glanced toward us a little too long. In the back seat, my hands moved on their own, reaching into my bag for my phone. Evan flashed in my mind so vividly it felt like a punch. He was at the townhouse, probably coloring, probably asking Mrs. Halpern for another cookie, probably assuming I would come back because I always came back. If something happened to me, the contract clause rose like a ghost. Guardianship, authority, household control. I swallowed hard and forced my thoughts into a straight line. We were being followed. That meant someone wanted to know where I was going. Or someone wanted me. My throat tightened. Because in this world, a car tailing you wasn't a prank. It was a message. Marcus's driving changed in subtle ways. Smoother acceleration, more decisive lane changes. The kind of movement that didn't attract attention but also didn't allow anyone to trap us easily. I watched the SUV mimic us anyway. My phone felt heavy in my hand, like it knew it was about to carry bad news. Then the screen lit up. A name. Damian. For a second I just stared at it, shocked by the timing. As if he'd been watching the same mirror I was watching. As if he already knew. Which, given the cameras, the guards, the way nothing in my life seemed truly private anymore. Maybe he did. My thumb hovered over the screen, and in that suspended moment, cars flowing around us, the SUV behind us closing the distance by a hair, I understood something that made my blood go cold. This wasn't someone trying to scare me. If it was intimidation, they'd have made themselves obvious. They'd have let me see a face. They'd have wanted me to run back to the townhouse shaking, grateful for Damian's protection. But this SUV stayed controlled. Patient. Strategic. The kind of patience you have when you plan to take your time. When you plan to take someone alive. I answered the call, and before any sound could reach me through the phone, before my mind could form words, my body did what it always did when fear hit the deepest place in me. It thought of my son, and it begged the universe, silently, not to let him grow up learning that his mother disappeared because she trusted the wrong kind of safety. The moment I answered, I didn't even say hello. I didn't have the breath for it. All I could do was hold the phone to my ear like it was a lifeline and listen for anything that would tell me I wasn't alone in that moving box of glass and steel. Damian's voice came through tight and controlled, but there was an edge underneath it that made my stomach flip. Not anger, not annoyance. Urgency. The kind of urgency that has teeth. Without giving me room to speak, he was already tracking me. I could feel it in the way his words landed, like he could see my route the same way I could see the SUV in the mirror. Like the city itself was a chessboard, and my car was a piece someone was trying to steal. Marcus drove one-handed for a moment, the other hand resting near the console as if he could reach something quickly. His eyes stayed on the mirror. His posture changed, shoulders tightening, his focus narrowing until everything about him said one thing: protocol. I realized then that this wasn't a new fear for him. This was a practiced fear. Damian's voice pressed into my ear again, fast, clipped, instructions braided with something he didn't want me to notice. He wasn't asking where I was. He was confirming it. He wasn't wondering if we were being followed. He already knew. My skin went cold. A part of me wanted to scream at him, "How did you know? How long have you been watching? How dare you make my life a surveillance system?" But the larger part of me, the part that belonged to Evan first and always, swallowed the rage and turned it into one clean question in my head. How do I get home? Home meant the townhouse. Home meant my son. Home meant the only place where at least the guards were ours. Marcus took a turn too sharp for comfort, cutting across 2 lanes with a smooth aggression that made my stomach drop. Tires hissed on wet pavement. The city outside blurred into streaks of gray and late afternoon gold. The SUV followed, not stumbling, not hesitating, matching. My breath came shallow. My fingers cramped around the phone. Damian kept talking, coordinating, calling someone, updating someone. I didn't hear names clearly. I heard movement. I heard the quiet violence of a man reaching for control while it slipped through his hands. I stared out the window and tried to orient myself. But New York in traffic is a maze even when you're calm. Under fear, it becomes a spinning tunnel of buildings and brake lights and strangers who don't know they're inches away from becoming collateral. A horn blared. Someone shouted. A bike messenger flashed past us like a ghost. Then the SUV surged closer. Close enough that I could see the faint reflection of its headlights in our rear window. Close enough that the shape of it filled my world. Marcus's jaw clenched so hard I saw the muscle jump. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I curled inward, shoulders hunched, arms instinctively folding over my middle like I could protect something precious there. It was an old reflex, a mother reflex. The way you cover your core when danger comes because your body believes it can shield what matters even if you have nothing else. My mind kept flashing Evan's face, his cowlick, his grin, the way he said my name when he wanted reassurance. The contract clause played in my head like a cruel soundtrack. If something happened to me, authority could shift. I swallowed hard enough to taste metal. Damian's voice sharpened again, and the sound of it made my eyes sting. He wasn't using titles. He wasn't using the cold language of ownership. He was using my name, Claire. The way he said it didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a prayer he didn't believe he was allowed to say out loud. And that more than the SUV, more than the traffic, more than the fear hit me like whiplash. Because I'd spent 3 months telling myself Damian Crowe didn't want me, that his protection was just business, that I was a strategic purchase. But no one says a purchase's name like that. The SUV pulled alongside us. My lungs forgot how to work. A shadow moved behind the tinted window. Something metallic caught the sun for half a second. Marcus yanked the wheel, and the car lurched hard into a side street so abruptly my shoulder slammed into the door. The seatbelt bit into my collarbone. My phone slipped, bounced against my palm. Then the sound came. A sharp crack that didn't belong in Manhattan traffic. Another. And another. Gunshots. The world narrowed into noise and glass and instinct. Marcus drove like he wasn't driving anymore, like he was wrestling the car through the city with sheer will. We tore down a street lined with parked cars, the buildings closing in, the sound of the SUV's engine snarling behind us. A bullet punched into the rear window. The safety glass spiderwebbed, then exploded inward in glittering shards that sprayed over the back seat like cruel confetti. I screamed without sound, ducking low, my arms wrapping around my head, my body folding over itself. The phone was on the seat now. Damian's voice, a thin, distorted sound through the speaker as it skidded under my thigh. I fumbled for it with shaking hands, fingers slipping on glass dust. When I got it back to my ear, my voice came out broken, but I forced air into it anyway. I needed him to know I was alive. I needed someone to anchor me to reality. Damian's voice hit me again, harsher now, threaded with something I didn't know how to name except fear. Real fear. Not the kind men like him admitted. He was telling me to stay low. He was telling Marcus where to go. He was telling someone else, Ray. Maybe that backup was closing in. I didn't know how he could stay so focused while I was coming apart. Maybe that was who he was. Maybe that was why my father had sold me to him. The SUV closed the gap again. Another crack. Another burst of glass. Marcus swerved, tires screaming. The car fishtailed, then corrected. I tasted bile. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep hold of the phone. I couldn't stop thinking about Evan. About how if I died here, on a random street in New York, my son would grow up inside Damian's house. Under Damian's rules. Under Damian's cameras. The thought was a knife. The city opened up into a wider stretch of road, and Marcus took it like a lifeline, accelerating hard. The engine growled. The buildings began to thin. Industrial blocks, warehouses, fewer pedestrians. I recognized nothing until I recognized the feeling. This wasn't the part of town where people wandered. This was the part of town where people disappeared. My breath caught. Marcus turned again through a gap between two buildings that looked like it shouldn't even be a road. A metal gate loomed ahead, tall and ugly and locked. For a split second, I thought we were trapped. Then the gate opened. Not slowly. Instantly. As if someone had been waiting with their hand on the switch. Marcus gunned the engine and the car shot through, just as the gate began to close behind us. The SUV slammed forward, trying to follow. But the metal barrier met it with a screech of impact that vibrated through the air. The sound was brutal. Final. I stayed curled low, shaking, listening for more gunfire. For footsteps, for the SUV pushing through. Instead, there was a sudden flood of movement outside. Men appearing from shadows, weapons raised, voices low and rapid. Guards. Lots of them. Not strangers. Damian's men. Marcus pulled the car deeper into the compound and braked hard. The world jolted. My head snapped up. And then I saw him. Damian Crowe crossing the concrete like a storm. His suit jacket was gone. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. His hair wasn't perfect anymore. His face, usually carved into calm, was pale beneath the tan, and his eyes were wild in a way I hadn't seen before. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had just watched something precious almost vanish. He yanked open the back door before anyone else could touch it, and the cold air rushed in. His hands were on me, immediately checking my shoulders. My arms, my face fast, thorough, almost frantic. I flinched at the contact out of reflex, but he didn't pull back. He didn't ask permission. He just kept searching, as if his hands could rewrite the last 10 minutes. I tried to speak. My throat couldn't find words. All that came out was a broken sound. Damian's focus locked on my face. His breathing was hard. His hands trembled, just slightly, like his body was betraying him. When his gaze dropped to the glass dust on my dress, his jaw tightened so hard it looked painful. For a moment, I thought he might turn around and rip the world apart with his bare hands. Then he pulled me out of the car. Not gently, not roughly, urgently. His arms wrapped around me, crushing me to his chest like he was trying to keep me from slipping away again. I felt his heart hammering through his shirt, fast and violent, matching the frantic rhythm of mine. I went still in his hold, because I could feel it. He was shaking. Damian Crowe, the man everyone feared, the man my father worshipped, the man who had treated my life like a contract, was shaking like he'd almost lost something he couldn't replace. The realization hit me so hard my eyes burned. This was the first real Damian I'd seen. Not the controlled strategist, not the cold groom, not the distant husband. A man who had been terrified. I pulled back just enough to breathe, my hands braced against his chest. The glass dust on my palms sparkled in the light, like a cruel reminder of how close it had been. Damian's gaze tracked the movement as if he couldn't help it, as if every inch of me needed to be accounted for. Around us, his men swarmed the perimeter. Someone spoke into a radio. Someone else checked the gate. The sound of the crashed SUV echoed in the background like a warning. Damian didn't move away from me. He guided me forward, his hand firm at my elbow, steering me into the building as if the outside air itself was dangerous. The safe house was exactly what I would have expected from him if I'd allowed myself to imagine it. Fortified, clean, modern. A place designed to withstand violence while pretending it was a luxury apartment. Thick glass windows overlooking dark water, polished concrete floors, steel doors, soft furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. A beautiful bunker. A gilded cage. Only this time, I wasn't locked inside it alone. Damian was inside with me. He paced the main room like a predator trapped behind glass. His steps were measured, but the energy coming off him was too sharp, too restless, like his skin didn't fit right. I sat on the sofa with a blanket someone had placed over my shoulders. I didn't remember them doing it. I just suddenly had warmth around me and my body still couldn't stop shaking. A glass appeared in my hands, water, not alcohol. I noticed that, the small human detail of it. Someone had paid attention to what I needed rather than what men in his world usually offered. My brain latched onto the detail because it was easier than looking at the bigger thing. Damian's fear, his control slipping, his voice on the phone, saying my name like it mattered. He spoke to someone, Ray. I assumed about lockdowns, about retaliation, about the Viscari crew paying for this. He spoke like a commander giving orders, but every few seconds his eyes snapped back to me. Checking, checking, checking. Like if he looked away, I'd disappear. When the door finally shut and the men outside fell into quiet positions, the room felt too still. The adrenaline started to drain. That's when the anger showed up. It came hot and clean, rising through me like fire. Because now that I was alive, now that my lungs were working again, all the things I'd swallowed for months surfaced at once. The cameras, the contract, Evan, the way my entire existence had been treated as something to manage. Damian turned from the window, his gaze pinning me like he could feel the shift in me without words. I tightened the blanket around my shoulders and forced myself to sit straighter. My voice shook, but I didn't let it break. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say I was grateful. Instead, I made myself think of Evan, how quiet he'd become, how polite, how careful, and I let that pain become steel. In my mind, I spoke the truth to Damian the only way I could without direct quotes. I wasn't a possession. My son wasn't a complication, and this protection of his felt too much like a leash. Damian's face hardened in a flash, defensive instinct rising like a wall. He tried to frame it as safety, as responsibility, as the only way to keep threats away, but I didn't let the words slide past me anymore. Because I had just felt bullets cracking through the air behind my head. I had just seen a man try to take me off the street like I was cargo. I couldn't afford polite silence. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heart still racing, and I forced my point through the shaking. Safety without choice is not safety. It's imprisonment with nicer furniture. Damian's jaw flexed. His hands curled into fists and then released again, like he was struggling not to shatter something. His eyes flicked to the blanket around me, to the glass in my hand, to the way my fingers trembled. For a second, I saw the conflict in him, the part that wanted to control the world, the part that had just realized the world didn't care what he wanted. And beneath that, something else. Guilt. That's what it looked like. I didn't soften. I couldn't. I brought up the wound I'd carried since the wedding day, the one that lived under everything like a bruise you keep pressing because you need to know it's still there. In my mind, the memory came back sharp and clear. The study door, the half-open crack, his voice, the way he had dismissed me before I ever had a chance. I didn't repeat the exact words. I couldn't. Not like that. Not out loud. But I made sure he understood what I meant. That I had heard him. That I had heard him say he didn't want me. That I had heard Evan reduced to a complication. Damian's face changed so fast it stole my breath. The color drained. His posture froze. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked caught. Not by an enemy. By the consequences of his own choices. He turned away, stepping to the window again, staring out at the dark water like it could give him answers. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own pulse. When he finally moved, he didn't pace anymore. He came closer, slowly, like he wasn't sure he deserved the space. And when he looked at me, his eyes weren't cold. They were raw. The truth he gave me didn't come like a pretty confession. It came like something dragged out of him, something he'd kept locked away because it was dangerous. He hadn't said those things because I meant nothing. He'd said them because I meant too much. The idea landed in my chest like a shockwave. He had been terrified not of me as a person, but of what I made him feel, of the vulnerability of wanting, of the risk of caring. In his world, caring was an exposed throat, and I, apparently, had been an exposed throat from the moment he saw me. I stared at him, trying to fit that into the story I'd built in my head for 3 months. The story where he was a cold man who married me for strategy, and kept me distant because he didn't want me. This truth flipped it upside down. It made me furious in a new way. Because if he had wanted me, if he had felt something, then the cruelty of the distance wasn't accidental. It was a choice A choice to protect himself at my expense. I felt tears rise. I refused to let them fall. Instead, I let my voice go quiet and sharp in my head. So he had hurt me first, because he'd been scared. Damian didn't deny it. His expression tightened with something like shame. He looked like a man who had built an empire out of control and had just realized control didn't make him safe. The near death of today had stripped him down. It had shown him what mattered. It had shown him, in a way he couldn't talk around anymore, that he would burn down the world before he let anything happen to me. That intensity should have terrified me. It did. And it also did something else. It made me feel seen, not as leverage, as a person with impact. My hands shook as I set the water glass down. My mind raced, searching for manipulation, for strategy, for the angle. But all I saw in him was a brutal kind of honesty, ugly, unpolished, unwilling, like he didn't even like the truth. But he was giving it anyway. I didn't forgive him, not in that moment. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you flipped, but I did something else. I chose terms, because if I was going to survive this marriage and keep Evan safe, I needed power, not apologies. So I laid it out, not as demands screamed across a room, but as calm conditions shaped by fear and motherhood, and the part of me that refused to be erased. If I was a target because of his name, then I had a right to know what we were up against. If my son's future was tied to this house, then I would not be treated like a guest in my own life. If he wanted me close, then he didn't get to keep me ignorant. Truth. Transparency. A voice. No more protection through deception. No more decisions that touched Evan without my consent. Damian listened like every word mattered. Like he wasn't used to anyone speaking to him that way, and he couldn't decide whether it was infuriating or relieving. When he finally nodded, it wasn't casual. It was deliberate. He agreed. But then he asked for something back, not in the language of a boss issuing terms, but in the language of a man stepping into a space he didn't know how to stand in. He wanted the same honesty. He wanted me to tell him when he was failing me. He wanted me to stop pretending I was fine when I wasn't. He wanted to know what I needed. The request hit me harder than any gunshot, because it meant he was handing me something dangerous. Access. The power to hurt him. The power to matter. I studied his face for a long moment, searching for the familiar mask. It wasn't there. Just exhaustion, fear, a kind of quiet desperation I didn't want to admit I understood. I exhaled slowly, the first real breath I'd taken since the SUV appeared behind us. In that breath, something shifted. Not love, not softness. Something more practical and more rare in our world. A beginning. I didn't tell him everything was okay. It wasn't. But I gave him the only thing that felt possible right then. A chance. Because today had proven one thing beyond any doubt. Whether he wanted me or not, his enemies would use me. And I refused to be used without fighting back. Damian's shoulders loosened a fraction, like he'd been holding himself rigid against hope. He reached toward me, hesitated, then let his hand rest briefly on the back of the sofa, instead of touching me again like he was trying to respect the boundary without losing proximity. Outside, the compound stayed locked down. Radios murmured. Footsteps passed now and then. The danger wasn't gone. It had just changed shape. And as I sat there, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't mine, in a safe house that felt like a beautiful prison, with a man who finally looked human across from me, I understood the next truth too. This wasn't going to end with today. Whoever sent that SUV didn't just want to scare us. They wanted a weakness. They wanted proof Damian Crowe could bleed. And now that I'd made my terms clear, now that I'd demanded a voice and a seat beside him, they were going to learn something else. I wasn't just his wife. I was his line. And anyone who tried to cross it was going to meet both of us, whether we were ready or not. The war lasted 7 days, and none of them felt like a victory while we were living them. It felt like waiting in a room that never stopped vibrating, like hearing footsteps in the hallway, even when no one was there, like counting minutes by the sound of a door opening and closing, because every time Damian left, I didn't know if he would come back. The safe house became our world. It was bright and expensive, and designed to look calm, which somehow made it worse. The furniture stayed perfect, while people bled. The windows showed the river moving like nothing in the city had changed. The walls didn't flinch when the radios crackled with updates. The first night after the attack, Damian left just after 9. He didn't make a show of it. No dramatic goodbye, no tender promises. He simply changed his shirt, checked his weapon, and walked out with the kind of calm that only comes from being used to violence. But his eyes lingered on me before he went. Not like a husband, like a man memorizing a face in case he didn't get to see it again. I waited until the door shut, Then I checked my phone again and again, like checking could keep him alive. Evan was at the townhouse with extra guards, extra rules, extra everything. I spoke to him before bed, keeping my voice warm, telling him Mommy was working and would be home soon. He tried to be brave for me. I could hear it in the way he kept his questions small. He wanted to know if the guards were sleeping in the hallway again. He wanted to know if he could still go to the garden tomorrow. He wanted to know if I was safe. Every question was a little knife, because it meant he was learning the wrong vocabulary for childhood. After the call, I stared at the blank safehouse ceiling and tried not to imagine what it would feel like to tell my son I wasn't coming home. Damian returned a little after 2 in the morning. I heard him before. I saw him, the heavy door, the low voices, the careful quiet of men trying not to wake someone while carrying news that could never be gentle. When he stepped into the living area, his shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was dried blood on his knuckles, not all of it his. His face looked carved from stone again, but the stone was cracked. He didn't go to the bar first. He came straight to me. I'd been sitting on the sofa, pretending to read, though the words on the page had been swimming for an hour. I dropped the book without thinking. My body moved toward him like it had been pulled by gravity. He let me. That was new. He sat down heavily, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for miles. In the safehouse light, I saw bruising blooming along his ribs under the fabric. I saw the way he favored one wrist. I didn't ask if he was okay. That question was too useless in this life. Instead, I found the first aid kit and knelt beside him, hands steady in a way I didn't feel. I cleaned his knuckles with antiseptic, and he didn't flinch. He watched me work, eyes tracking my movements like he couldn't decide whether to be ashamed or grateful. There was a strange intimacy in it, battlefield intimacy. The kind that isn't romantic, not at first. It's practical, honest. It says, "I can see what this costs you." As I wrapped his hand, I noticed something small and absurd. Someone had stocked chamomile tea in the safehouse kitchen. My brand, the one I drank at night when my nerves wouldn't settle. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did, because it meant Damian had noticed. It meant he'd remembered. It meant he'd ordered someone to have it here without making it a performance. Little acts like that are dangerous. They sneak past your defenses. When I handed him water, he took it without comment. When I adjusted the lamp so the light wouldn't hit my eyes too harshly, he didn't ask why. He simply reached over and dimmed it another notch, as if he'd been watching my face long enough to know what made me tense. And I hated myself for how much those tiny things softened the edges of my anger. The second night was worse. Not because the fighting was louder, most of it happened out there, beyond the safe house, beyond the walls. It was worse because the waiting stretched longer, because I started to understand the rhythm. The city didn't sleep, and neither did men like Damian. He left at 10. He came back near dawn. This time he didn't sit down right away. He went to the sink and scrubbed his hands until his skin turned red, as if he could wash off what he'd done. I watched him and realized something else I hadn't wanted to see before. Loneliness wasn't an emotion Damian Crowe talked about, but it lived in his body. It lived in the way he carried himself like there was no one to lean on. It lived in the way his men respected him, feared him, obeyed him but didn't touch him. Not really. Not in the human way. Not in the way that says, you don't have to hold the whole world alone. I told him about Evan. Not the sanitized version. The real version. How Evan was getting too quiet. How he watched doors now. How he asked permission before he laughed too loudly because he didn't want to bother the guards. How he had started sleeping with his shoes lined up neatly by the bed, like he was preparing for an emergency he didn't have the words for. Damian listened with a stillness that felt like restraint. His eyes went colder, but not at me. At the world. At the people who'd made my son adapt to fear. When he spoke about responsibility, about protecting what was his Evan's name, didn't sound like an inconvenience anymore. It sounded like a weight Damian had accepted and didn't know how to admit he cared about. That terrified me, because if Damian truly started to love Evan, it would tether us tighter than any contract clause ever could. And then the third night came with the first real casualty. Damian didn't tell me right away. He came back silent, face closed, shoulders heavier. One of his men had died in a warehouse raid. Another was in the hospital. The Vescari crew had been bold, and Damian had responded the only way men like him knew how. Hard, fast, ruthless. I sat beside him on the sofa after I cleaned another cut on his hand, and I felt the weight of it settle on me like wet concrete. Because this wasn't just a chess match between criminals. There were families behind these men. There were children behind these guns. And once you start counting children, violence stops being abstract. The fourth night is the one I'll never forget. because that's when betrayal stepped out of the shadows and showed its face. Ray arrived just before midnight, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His suit was wrinkled at the shoulders. His eyes were bloodshot. He carried a folder like it was heavier than paper should be. He handed it to Damian, then looked at me briefly, the way men look when they're about to say something they wish they didn't have to say in front of a woman. But Damian didn't send me away. That was part of the new foundation we'd built. Transparency, truth, a voice. So I stayed. Damian flipped through the contents of the folder, his expression barely changing. But I saw the moment the information hit him. It was in his hand, not his face. His fingers tightened, then went still. The room cooled. Ray's presence pressed into the air like bad weather. And I understood what the folder contained before anyone explained it clearly, because in this life, you learn to read men the way you read signs on a highway, quickly, accurately, because missing one can kill you. The leak wasn't a careless soldier. It wasn't a compromised driver. It was blood. Luca Crowe, Damian's cousin. Family. The word family had already been twisted for me by my father. But this was a different kind of twist. This was the kind that makes you realize safety isn't a place. It's a person, and even that can be taken. The information landed in me like nausea. Luca had been feeding routes, schedules, gaps. He had been helping the Vescari crew anticipate our moves. He had been the reason the SUV knew where to find me, the reason the attack felt planned instead of opportunistic. I watched Damian's face like I was staring at a cracked dam, waiting to see what would spill out. Rage didn't explode. It crystallized. His eyes went flat. His breathing slowed. His body turning into that frightening stillness that meant he'd moved past anger and into decision. I didn't ask why Luca had done it. In this world, greed and resentment don't require deep motives. Sometimes men betray because they're hungry. Sometimes they betray because they think they deserve more. What mattered was the truth underneath. If blood could come from inside the family, where was safe? The safe house suddenly didn't feel safe at all. That night, Damian didn't drink. He didn't pace. He sat at the table with the folder spread out and made plans with Ray in low voices while I sat on the sofa holding my knees to my chest, trying to keep my thoughts from flying straight to Evan. Because Luca wasn't just betraying Damian. He was betraying my child. He was betraying every kid this war would touch. Damian left before dawn. He returned in the gray light of morning with a bruise forming along his cheekbone and a look on his face I didn't want to interpret too closely. Luca's name didn't come up again in front of me. Not yet. But the air shifted. The war, which had been dangerous, became personal. By the 7th day, the Vescari crew was broken. It didn't happen in a cinematic explosion. It happened in small, ugly increments. Raids, counter-raids, men arrested or disappearing, cash routes cut, allies switching sides when the risk got too high. Damian came back late every night, sometimes bloodied, always exhausted. And I learned his war face. The way he turned tenderness into precision. The way he could hold my wrist gently while I cleaned his knuckles, then stand up and become someone who could order a city to burn. I also learned something else. Slowly, painfully, Damian wasn't proud of the blood. He was resigned to it. That difference mattered to me, because it meant there was still a piece of him that remembered being human. When Ray finally told us the Vescari leadership had been neutralized, Damian's expression didn't brighten. It didn't celebrate. It simply loosened, like he'd been carrying a weight and could set it down for one breath. Relief came, but it was complicated, because alongside relief came numbers. Men dead. Men wounded. Families shattered. I couldn't stop thinking about the widows. About the kids who would be put to bed by mothers who now had to pretend everything was fine the same way I pretended with Evan. Damian assumed they would handle it the way his world always handled it. Money, funerals, silence, and moving on. But I couldn't accept that as enough. Not after seeing what fear had done to my own child in just 3 months. So I insisted on meeting them. Not as a photo opportunity, not as a performance. As a human being. Damian looked at me like I was asking to walk into a fire. Maybe I was. Grief can burn worse than bullets. But I knew I had to do it. Because if this life was going to touch children, then someone had to look those children in the eye and admit the cost. The first visit was to a small apartment in Queens. It smelled like laundry detergent and cheap coffee. A toy truck sat on the floor near the door like someone had been playing, and then stopped mid-game because the world changed. The widow didn't cry at first. She stood straight, shoulders rigid, like she was refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her son, maybe 5, peeked around her leg and stared at Damian with big eyes, trying to figure out if the man in the suit was the reason his father didn't come home. I felt my throat close. I didn't have magic words. I didn't have the power to undo anything, so I did the only thing I could. I showed up. I sat at their kitchen table. I listened. I held her hand when she finally collapsed into tears. I looked at the child and tried to make my eyes soft instead of frightened. Damian stood behind me the entire time, a solid shadow in the doorway, his presence both protective and terrifying. But I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen before. Regret. Not for the war, not for the necessity, for the children, for the ripples he couldn't stop creating. We visited 3 families like that, 3 kitchens, 3 sets of small shoes by the door, 3 mothers trying not to fall apart, 3 kids absorbing fear like it was air. Each time I left, I felt hollow and heavy. Each time Damian walked beside me, his hand at my back, I felt the way his men looked at me change. It wasn't just respect for the boss's wife. It was something closer to loyalty. Because I had done what money couldn't do. I had acknowledged their grief. I had treated their families like they mattered beyond their usefulness. On the ride back after the last visit, Damian's gaze stayed on me longer than usual. Not possessive, not assessing. Something like pride, mixed with fear. Fear of how much he was changing because of me. Fear of how much I was now woven into his world. When Ray confirmed the threat was neutralized enough for us to return to the townhouse, I expected the townhouse to feel like the same prison. Instead, it felt unfinished, like maybe the walls could be repurposed. Damian didn't send me back to my east wing. He didn't retreat to his west. He led me down a corridor that had been closed off since the wedding. A corridor I'd assumed was unused storage or empty rooms no one cared about. A set of doors opened, and the air changed. The closed-off wing didn't smell like marble polish. It smelled like wood. Old wood, warmed by time. A faint trace of fireplace ash. Something softer, lived in. The floors were hardwood, not stone. The molding was carved, not minimal. The windows faced the river, but the rooms felt like they belonged to people, not a fortress. Damian's grandmother's wing, Ray had mentioned once in passing. A part of the house Damian's father had shut down after she died. Standing there, I could feel the difference immediately. Warmth. Memory. The kind of space a woman makes when she's trying to keep a family human. Evan walked in behind me, holding my hand, and his eyes widened. He let out a small, surprised laugh when he saw a dusty old built-in bookshelf. The sound punched me in the chest, because it was the first unguarded laugh I'd heard from him in weeks. Damian watched Evan's reaction with a stillness that looked like he was taking notes in his soul. Over the next days, we began to transform that wing, not with a team of designers turning it into another showroom, with real choices, with compromises, with the strange intimacy of building something together. I picked paint colors that felt warm instead of cold. Soft gray, cream, muted green that reminded me of parks instead of prisons. I chose art that didn't scream wealth, art that made you breathe. Damian handled security upgrades quietly, without turning the place into a bunker. He placed cameras outside the wing instead of inside it. He adjusted sightlines so guards could protect without hovering in every doorway. That mattered. It was one of the first times he showed me he could listen. Evan helped, in his own way. He insisted his room needed a dinosaur corner, which turned into a little reading nook by a window. One afternoon, he sat there with a book while a contractor worked down the hall, and I watched his shoulders relax in a way I hadn't seen since before the wedding. For a moment, the house almost felt like ours. Then Damian did something that made me realize he meant it. It happened quietly, the way most power moves happen in real life. No announcement, no dramatic scene. One evening around 9, while Evan was upstairs brushing his teeth, Damian handed me a folder and sat across from me at the old wooden desk in the renovated wing. The folder was thick. Legal documents, account information, property lists. At first, my stomach clenched, because paper had never meant anything good for me. Paper was how my father sold me. Paper was how the contract reached into Evan's future. But this folder was different. The words inside weren't about restricting me. They were about transferring power. Damian had altered ownership structures, accounts, properties, decision authority. Things that, in his world, rarely belonged to a wife. He was making me a co-owner, not a beneficiary, not a dependent. A partner with real leverage. I stared at the pages until the letters blurred, trying to understand the scale of what he was offering. Because this wasn't romance. This was something stronger. This was him backing his words with something that could cost him. If he died, I wouldn't be left as a pretty widow with guards and sympathy. I would be powerful. Too powerful for anyone to treat me like an afterthought. My throat tightened. My hands trembled as I held the paper. A part of me wanted to accuse him again of controlling, of trapping, of wrapping chains in velvet. But another part of me, the part that had demanded truth and a voice, recognized this for what it was. A risk. A man like Damian didn't give away power unless he believed in what he was building. I looked up at him. His face was calm, but his eyes weren't cold. They carried that wary honesty I'd seen in the safehouse, the honesty that looked like he didn't know how to be tender without bracing for impact. In my mind, I could feel what he was saying without him needing to say it out loud. He wasn't just protecting me as an asset anymore. He was arming me. For myself. For Evan. For whatever came next. And that's when the warmth hit me fully, not sweet, not naive, but real. Because for the first time since the wedding, I could imagine a future where Evan didn't grow up as a guest in someone else's empire. He could grow up in a home, a complicated home, a dangerous home, but a place where his mother had power, not just protection. That night, after Evan fell asleep in his dinosaur nook, I stood by the window with Damian beside me and watched the river move in the dark. The city looked peaceful from this height, like it was pretending the last 7 days hadn't happened. I felt Damian's presence close, steady, protective, human. For a brief, breathtaking moment, happiness didn't feel like a trap. It felt like something we might actually be allowed to touch. And that's when the ominous thought crept in, quiet as a whisper, sharp as a blade. In Damian's world, happiness was always the scent that attracted predators. If our enemies thought domestic warmth made him weak, they would come sniffing. And now that I had power, now that I had a place at the table, the next threat wouldn't just target Damian. It would target the thing we were building, the thing that finally felt like ours. The first time it happened, I blamed the coffee. It was a cold morning, the kind New York does best when the sky looks scrubbed clean and the air bites at your lungs. I'd barely made it past the kitchen doorway before nausea rolled through me so fast I had to clamp a hand over my mouth and sprint for the nearest bathroom. I knelt on the tile, breathing hard, telling myself it was stress, leftover adrenaline, a stomach bug, anything except the one thought that was already forming in the back of my mind like a slow bruise. Because I knew my body. I'd been a mother before. I remembered what it felt like when a new life started to rewrite every rule. Still, I tried to outthink it. I rinsed my mouth, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection like I could intimidate the truth into leaving. I looked pale. My eyes looked too sharp, like my nervous system had stopped trusting peace. I pressed my fingers to the cool marble counter until the nausea eased. When I walked back out, Evan was at the table, swinging his legs, cereal bowl in front of him. He looked up at me with that careful awareness he'd developed over the last months, the way kids do when they've learned adults carry invisible storms. He didn't ask if I was okay right away. He watched first. He assessed. Then he asked softly. Like volume alone could keep fear away. I made my face do something warm. I told him it was nothing. I kissed the top of his head and made a joke about my stomach being dramatic. He smiled, but he didn't fully relax. Neither did I. It happened again the next morning. And the next. By the third day, it wasn't just nausea. It was smell sensitivity that made me want to gag when the cook sautéed garlic. It was exhaustion that clung to my bones like wet wool. It was the way my breasts ached, the way my appetite swung between hunger and revulsion. The fourth morning, I stood in the bathroom, staring at the calendar on my phone, and my throat tightened. I was late, not by a day or two. Late enough that denial started to look like stupidity. And pregnancy in Damian Crowe's world wasn't just personal news. It was a political event, a vulnerability, a weapon someone would use. I pressed my palm to my stomach, flat and normal and quiet, and my mind ran straight to Evan again. Because adding another baby into this life didn't just change me. It changed him. It changed his safety, his future, his place in a house that still felt like it could decide his fate without asking me. I remembered the clause in the contract about guardianship like it was tattooed under my skin. I told myself to breathe. Then I told myself to stop stalling. I didn't send anyone to buy a test. I didn't want staff eyes. I didn't want a paper trail inside a house where secrets always seemed to leak. I waited until mid-morning, when Damian was out, and I took a car to a pharmacy 3 neighborhoods away with a driver who didn't speak unless necessary. I wore sunglasses and a baseball cap like I was doing something shameful. That's what this world did to motherhood. It turned life into contraband. Back home, I locked myself in the bathroom with the bag and stared at it for a full minute before I could move. My hands shook as I opened the box. Not because I was afraid of being pregnant, because I was afraid of what being pregnant would mean in a world built on leverage. I followed the instructions like I was defusing a bomb. I set the test on the counter and watched the seconds crawl by. Those seconds felt like a lifetime. My mind played two futures at once. In one, I was a mother again. I held a tiny body and felt that rush of awe that makes the world go soft around the edges. I gave Evan a sibling. I built something bigger than fear. In the other, someone used my pregnancy as a reason to strike. Someone took me from Evan. Someone turned a baby into a headline whispered over bourbon at a table full of men. The timer finished. I looked down, and the world tilted. Positive. My breath left me in a sharp, involuntary sound. I grabbed the edge of the counter as if the room might slide out from under me. I stared until the lines blurred. Then I sat on the closed toilet lid because my knees went weak. Pregnant. It was a simple fact with an endless list of consequences. For a moment, joy flickered. Pure, instinctive, warm. I saw a tiny hand wrapped around my finger. I saw Evan laughing at a baby making goofy noises. I felt the sweetness of new beginnings. Then fear stomped it flat. I pressed my hand to my belly again, as if I could shield the baby with skin and intention alone. I didn't cry. Not yet. I did what I always did when my world changed. I made a plan. When Damian came home later that afternoon, I was sitting in the renovated wing with paperwork spread out in front of me like I was working. My posture was calm. My face was calm. Inside, my heart was sprinting. Evan was upstairs in his dinosaur nook, half listening to a story while he built something out of blocks. I'd kept him busy on purpose. I needed a few minutes where I didn't have to perform steadiness for him. Damian walked in, jacket draped over one arm, phone in his hand. He looked tired in the way he always looked tired now, like the war had ended, but the vigilance never did. His eyes flicked to me immediately, sharp. He noticed everything, especially lately. I didn't ease into it. If I waited, I would back out. If I backed out, I'd be carrying this alone inside my own body. And I wasn't doing that again. I didn't survive being a single mom to become silent now. So I told him, simply, that I thought I was pregnant. The change in him was instant and complete. It wasn't the cold mask. It wasn't the boss face. It was stillness. Like his nervous system paused to process the reality. For a second, his eyes looked almost blank, and my stomach clenched with panic. I thought of how men in his world treated heirs, how they treated pregnancy like a business asset, how that could swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. Then Damian moved. Fast. He crossed the room and dropped to a crouch in front of me, hands hovering near my knees like he didn't know what was allowed. His breathing sounded rough, like the air had gotten heavier. His gaze lifted to mine, and the emotion there hit me so hard my throat burned. Joy, real joy, and terror threaded through it like barbed wire. He reached a hand toward my stomach and stopped short, like he was afraid touching me would make it disappear. When his palm finally settled there, it was gentle in a way that didn't match his reputation, almost reverent. I nodded once. I told him I'd taken a test. His face changed again, softer at the edges, and then dangerously tight, like he was trying to hold both happiness and fear in the same body without splitting. He exhaled hard, and I realized his hands were shaking. Damian Crowe didn't shake, but he did now. He pulled me up into his arms, careful with pressure, holding me like something fragile and precious. I felt the truth of his fear in the way he clung, the way he checked my face like he needed confirmation I was real. He was thinking the same thing I was thinking. If someone could come for me before, they would come harder now. We decided to keep it quiet at first, not because we wanted secrecy for romance, but because secrecy was survival. We didn't tell staff. We didn't tell family. We didn't tell Maya. We didn't even tell Ray until we had to. For a few days, the pregnancy existed only between Damian and me, like a small, warm flame we protected with our bodies. Damian tried to build a safe bubble around it immediately. Security increased again, even though I'd thought we were already living at maximum. More guards, more cars, more restrictions disguised as precaution. He had someone deliver prenatal vitamins and a nutrition plan that looked like it belonged in a medical textbook. He arranged a doctor who would come to the house. He ordered the kitchen to adjust menus. He started watching what I ate like food could be an enemy. Part of me was grateful. Part of me wanted to scream, because his protection felt like love and a cage at the same time. I would wake up nauseated and find ginger tea by the bed before I even asked. The temperature in our room would be slightly warmer, like he'd noticed I'd started getting cold more easily. He'd shift the lighting in the hallway at night so it wasn't harsh on my eyes when I got up. Tiny care. But then he'd insist I didn't go anywhere without him. He'd try to cancel my charity meetings. He'd glance toward the doors every time I stood up too quickly, like my body was made of glass. I fought him on it gently at first. I reminded him I was still a person, not a vessel. He listened. He tried. But fear doesn't obey reason. Evan sensed the shift before I explained it. Kids always do. One evening, while I was helping him with homework, he kept watching me with those careful eyes again. He asked if I was sick, not just stomach sick. He asked why Damian was around more. He asked why the guards had changed positions near the stairs. I swallowed, then told him the truth in a way a 7-year-old could hold. I told him there was a baby growing in my belly. His face went through a rapid series of emotions: confusion, surprise, sudden excitement, then something else that made my heart ache: protectiveness. He leaned in, pressed his hand lightly against my stomach, and then glanced toward the hallway as if checking who might be listening. He whispered without words that he understood this wasn't just happy news. It was something to guard. And that's when I had to step away for a minute because my eyes burned. No child should learn to protect a pregnancy like it's classified information. 3 weeks into our secret, Ray came to Damian with a problem. I knew it was serious the moment I saw Ray's face. He didn't look frantic. He looked controlled, which in this world meant panic had already been wrangled into strategy. I was sitting on the edge of Damian's desk in the renovated wing, reviewing some charity budget notes, trying to pretend normal still existed. Damian was on a call. Ray waited until it ended. Then he laid out what he'd learned. Grant Vale was making moves. Grant Vale wasn't a rival crew like Vescari. He was something slipperier. A power broker who traded in whispers, alliances, and opportunities. A man who smiled at events and sharpened knives in private. Ray explained, in the careful way men do when they're delivering poison, that Grant had been telling other family heads Damian had gone soft. That marriage had dulled him. That domestic stability created cracks enemies could exploit. And then Ray delivered the part that made the room go cold. Grant already knew about the pregnancy. My hand went instinctively to my belly. I hadn't even started showing yet. But my body reacted as if it could hide the baby from the air itself. Damian went very still. I felt the temperature drop in the room, like his anger sucked oxygen away. I couldn't stop my mind from racing through possibilities. Staff, medical contacts, someone watching the house, someone watching me, someone watching Evan, someone watching Damian. If Grant knew, it meant either a leak or surveillance so tight it could see through walls. Ray didn't have a clean answer yet. He had theories. He had names to vet. He had patterns. But no certainty. And uncertainty is what kills you. The hook of dread caught under my ribs and stayed there. Because if Grant knew before I even told Maya, then this pregnancy wasn't private joy anymore. It was a target. Damian wanted to lock everything down. He wanted to cancel appearances. He wanted to disappear with me somewhere no one could reach. I couldn't let him. Because hiding would confirm the whispers. It would make us look weak. It would make the baby look like a liability instead of a legacy. And I'd learned something in the war with Vescari. Men like Grant don't stop when you shrink. They stop when you grow teeth. That's how the meeting happened. A gathering of family heads in a downtown property Damian used as neutral ground. A place designed for business, not comfort. A place where men measured each other in silence. Tradition said women didn't attend. Wives stayed home and smiled at charity galas. They didn't sit at tables where power moved. But I wasn't just a wife. I was now a co-owner, a mother, a partner whose body carried the future Grant was already trying to weaponize. So I insisted. Not dramatically, not with tears or pleading. With calm, I told Damian the truth. If they were whispering I made him weak, then I needed to be present to prove the opposite. Not as decoration, as evidence. Damian hesitated. I saw the conflict in him like a muscle twitching. Protectiveness versus strategy. Fear versus respect. Finally, he agreed with conditions. Proximity, security, no wandering, stay beside him. I agreed, because the goal wasn't freedom that night. The goal was impact. I dressed like armor. A black sheath dress, elegant and simple, expensive enough to signal status without screaming for attention. My hair pulled back cleanly. No dangling jewelry. No softness that could be interpreted as fragility. In the mirror, I didn't look like the Claire who used to take Evan to school with coffee in one hand and his backpack strap in the other. I looked like someone who could survive a room full of predators. And when Damian came to stand behind me, his hand settling briefly at my waist, I felt the weight of what we were doing. We weren't announcing a baby. We were announcing a dynasty. The meeting room smelled like cologne and old money. The lighting was warm, but the atmosphere was cold. 5 men sat around a long table, each one powerful in his own way. Their suits were perfect, Their eyes were sharper. When Damian and I entered together, the room's energy shifted. I felt eyes flick to me, then down, then back up. Assessing, calculating, looking for softness, looking for proof. Damian guided me to the seat at his right, placing me where everyone could see I wasn't an accessory tucked behind him. I sat with my back straight, my hands calm in my lap. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but I kept my face steady. Grant Vale was there. Of course. He looked polished, mid-40s, silver at the temples, the kind of man who could charm a room while planning how to dismantle it. His smile hit me like something slippery. He didn't need to say anything explicit. His gaze did it for him. He looked at me like he was already writing the story of how I would become Damian's downfall. I let my hand rest gently over my belly. Not dramatic. Not obvious to anyone who wasn't watching. But clear enough. A silent claim. My body. My child. My legacy. I saw a flicker in Grant's eyes. Not fear. Interest. The room tightened around that gesture. Men noticed. They always notice shifts in power, even when those shifts are small as a hand placement. Damian began the meeting the way he did everything: direct, controlled, refusing to apologize for existing. He addressed concerns about operations, territory, stability. The men responded with careful approval, cautious praise. Then Grant pushed, the way men like him push. He didn't accuse outright. He implied. He suggested. He wrapped criticism in concern. The shape of his message was clear even without words. Damian's domestic life was a vulnerability. His wife was a lever. His heir was a crack. I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't move. This was exactly why I came. Damian's response was not loud. It was lethal. He reframed everything. He made it clear through calm certainty in the way he looked at me that marriage hadn't dulled him. It had sharpened him, that I hadn't weakened him. I had made him more strategic, more focused, more dangerous, because now he had something worth building, not just something to defend. He didn't call me pretty. He didn't call me delicate. He treated me like an asset in the truest sense, a person with intelligence and influence, someone who understood consequence and loyalty. I watched the men's faces shift, one by one, not because they suddenly respected women, because they respected power, and I was sitting in the seat of power without flinching. Grant's smile tightened. His eyes darted briefly around the table, searching for allies, for someone to back his insinuations. He didn't find much, because no one wanted to gamble against Damian Crowe, especially not after the Viscari War, especially not when the woman beside him wasn't shrinking. The meeting didn't end with applause. It ended with recalibration, men leaving with new equations in their heads, men realizing the heir wasn't just vulnerability, the heir was continuity, and the woman carrying that heir was no longer a convenient pressure point. She was a protected line with teeth. When we finally walked out, Damian's hand found mine briefly, tight, grounding. His body stayed tense, like the room had been a battlefield without bullets. In the car ride back, the city lights blurred past the window, and I felt something like pride bloom in my chest. Not smugness, relief. Because the room had shifted, even slightly. And in this world, a slight shift could mean survival. But as the adrenaline faded, dread crept back in, quiet and certain. Men like Grant Vale don't retreat when they're embarrassed. They escalate. They don't forget being outplayed. They plan. And now the pregnancy was known. The whispers were public. The line had been drawn. I rested my hand over my belly again in the dark of the back seat, and felt the weight of the next truth settle in my bones. We had won a room. We had not won the war. And whatever Grant did next, it wouldn't be a whisper. It would be a strike. It was a little after 7 in the evening when I let myself pretend, for just a handful of minutes, that we were normal. The museum fundraiser glowed the way money always glows, soft lighting, string quartets in the corner, champagne flutes catching reflections like little mirrors. I wore a dress that didn't squeeze my stomach too tight, and I kept my posture calm even though I could feel the pregnancy changing my center of gravity. My hand drifted to my belly more than once without permission, a private reminder that there was something inside me worth protecting. Evan was home with the nanny and 2 guards positioned so discreetly you wouldn't notice them unless you knew how to look. He'd asked me before I left if I was coming back before bedtime. I'd promised yes, and he'd nodded like he was storing that promise in a careful place. I was mid-conversation with a donor about scholarship expansion when I felt the shift in the room, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle thinning of air, the kind you feel before a storm hits water. Ray appeared at my elbow like he'd been conjured from shadow. His face held the controlled urgency I'd learned to fear more than shouting. He didn't need to say much. His presence said everything. The bubble burst. My body reacted, first heat in my chest, cold in my hands. Then my mind snapped into the only mode it could afford. Focus. I nodded once, excused myself with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, and let Ray guide me out through a side corridor that smelled like stone and old paint. In the car, I learned the outline in fragments, an ambush disguised as business, a betrayal planned with patience, and Damian caught in the center of it. Grant Vale hadn't sulked after that meeting. He'd done what men like him do when humiliation touches their pride. He'd escalated. By the time we reached the townhouse, the front of the house looked calm, but the inside was chaos wearing a suit. Guards moved with quiet speed. Staff kept their heads down. The air felt charged with the kind of fear that tries to hide behind professionalism. I didn't run so much as I moved with purpose. Pregnant bodies don't sprint well, and adrenaline doesn't change physics. But it did change me. It sharpened my hearing. It narrowed my vision. It made every step feel like a decision. Damian was in our room. The sight of him hit me like a physical blow. He lay on the bed with his shirt cut away, skin pale under the light, blood dark against the sheets. It wasn't a movie amount of blood. It was the real kind, the kind that soaks into fabric and makes you realize bodies are fragile no matter how powerful the person inside them is. A doctor hovered close, private, discreet, fast. Hands moved with rehearsed competence. Tools clinked softly. Someone pressed gauze to a wound near Damian's shoulder. Another person checked his pulse. I heard my own breathing too fast, too shallow, and I forced it to slow because panic wouldn't help. Panic would take my hands away. Panic would make me useless. Damian's eyes found mine. Even injured, even pale, he still had that gravitational presence. But now it was stripped of performance. There was no room for myth in this moment, just a man bleeding, and the woman who loved him trying not to fall apart. I moved to his side and took his hand carefully, avoiding the places that looked tender. His fingers tightened around mine, just enough to tell me he was still here. Ray gave me the reality in the clearest terms he could manage. Grant had arranged a meeting under a neutral pretense, then sprung a coordinated attack meant to remove Damian from the board in one clean move. It wasn't rage. It was strategy. It was a power grab designed to create a vacuum Grant could fill. Damian survived because Damian always had contingency plans, and because Ray and the others fought like men who knew exactly what losing Damian would mean. But surviving wasn't the same as being safe. The doctor said Damian would live. The bullet had passed through cleanly. No major artery. He'd need rest. He'd need antibiotics. He'd need time. Time was the one thing enemies never allow. When Damian finally drifted into a medicated half-sleep, his breathing steadier, I stepped back and let the room exhale. My hands were shaking so hard I had to lace my fingers together to hide it. That's when Ray told me the second part. Grant was gone. Not missing in a careless way. Disappeared. Safe houses emptied. Contacts silent. Phones dark. A man who knew how to vanish had vanished, which meant this wasn't over. It was only shifting into a new phase. And with Damian wounded, the city would test who was really in control. I stood by the window and looked down at the streetlights pooling on wet pavement. I thought of Evan upstairs, asleep in a room that finally felt warm. I thought of the baby inside me. Quiet but present. A future that didn't know it was already in danger. Then I thought of Grant Vale somewhere out there, calculating how to finish what he started. Something inside me went cold. Not numb. Clear. I'd spent months learning that fear can either hollow you out, or it can forge you into something sharper. I didn't have the luxury of hollow. The next morning, after I checked on Evan and kissed his forehead until he smiled in his sleep, I went to Damian's study. Not the decorative office people toured at parties. The real one. The place where men made decisions that changed lives. Ray was there. So were 10 lieutenants' men who had bled for Damian. Men who had survived because they knew when to obey and when to question. When I walked in, I felt the skepticism hit me like a gust of cold air. Not all of it was disrespect. Some of it was uncertainty. They were trying to figure out what kind of problem I was. The boss's wife. A pregnant woman. A mother. A liability. I could have tried to prove myself with bravado, but that's what insecure people do. I didn't need to sound loud. I needed to sound inevitable. So I introduced myself the way this world understands. As family, as authority, as the person Damian had entrusted with power when he made me co-owner. I didn't demand respect. I assumed it. Then I asked questions. Not emotional questions. Tactical ones. What do we know about Grant's habits? Who handles his money? Who handles his logistics? Which of his people like him? And which fear him? Who would he trust when he's under pressure? As they spoke, I listened for patterns instead of details. Details change. Patterns reveal the spine of a plan. Grant Vale wasn't a street soldier. He was a whisper man. That meant he'd have a blind spot. Someone he believed was outside the game. Someone he thought couldn't be used against him. Someone he saw as personal, not political. A sister, a priest, a sponsor from rehab, a longtime aide who'd known him before he got powerful. A person who made him feel human, even if he pretended he didn't need that. I asked Ray for the list of names we'd already identified as close to Grant. Then I asked who among them had a routine that could be observed without tipping our hand. That's when it clicked. Not magic, not intuition, just human nature. Grant could disappear from the city, but he couldn't disappear from the people who anchored his identity. Everyone needs one person who believes the version of them that existed before the blood and money. We set discreet surveillance not on Grant directly, but on the connection. No flashy tale, no intimidation. Quiet eyes, quiet cameras, quiet patience. Some of the men looked like they were still deciding whether I could handle this, whether I could finish what needed to be finished, not just talk about it. I felt that test in the air, and I met it calmly, because I was tired of being assessed. I was tired of my motherhood being mistaken for weakness. So I told them, in the plainest emotional truth I could offer, that Grant had threatened my family. That meant he had threatened Evan. That meant he had threatened the baby inside me. And I was not the kind of woman who collapses when children are on the line. The room changed after that. Not warmer. More focused. They stopped seeing me as a symbol, and started seeing me as someone with a reason. And in this world, a reason is more dangerous than a weapon. 2 days later, the call came in. Movement. The connection Grant's blind spot had received a message. A courier. A sudden, unusual trip outside the city. A packed bag. A pattern shift so obvious it might as well have been a flare in the dark. We followed, not with a parade, with precision. The trail led to a cabin a couple of hours north, tucked near a strip of trees where cell service dipped and people went to disappear. And there he was, Grant Vale, hiding like a man who had always believed he was too smart to be caught. He was brought back bound, not dragged, not beaten for sport, just contained, neutralized, a problem put in a box. When they told me they had him, my first instinct was to run to Damian's room. Instead, I walked, slowly, deliberately, because leadership isn't just making decisions. It's showing people you won't unravel when the stakes are highest. Damian was sitting up by then, pale but awake, pain managed but not gone. His eyes sharpened the moment I told him. The pride there was dangerous and tender at the same time, dangerous because it made him want to do too much too soon. Tender because he looked at me like I'd become something he hadn't anticipated. We agreed on one thing. Grant needed to see the truth. Not through words, through reality. So that night, I stood beside Damian as Grant was brought into the cellar. The air down there was cool and smelled like oak and old wine. The lighting was dim enough to hide softness, perfect for the kind of theater men like Grant understand. Grant looked up and saw me, and I watched the moment his calculation faltered. Not because he feared a woman, because he hadn't expected the woman he dismissed to be the one who found him. I didn't need to say anything. I let my hand rest over my belly, calm and steady. Legacy, continuity, the future he had tried to weaponize now staring him down. Then I looked at Damian and gave him the smallest nod. I didn't stay for what came after. I didn't need to. Violence wasn't the point. Safety was. Family was. When I walked back upstairs, Ray fell into step behind us, and the house felt quieter. Not peaceful, this world never truly becomes peaceful, but quieter in the way it gets when a threat has been removed. 3 months later, New York was buried under a snowstorm. The kind that makes the city look gentle, like it's trying to pretend it doesn't know what's happening behind penthouse windows and locked doors. My labor started just after midnight. The contractions came like a wave I couldn't reason with. The doctor arrived. Damian hovered in a way that would have annoyed me if I hadn't been too busy bringing a human into the world. Damian looked more terrified in that room than I had ever seen him in any war. He held my hand. He counted breaths with me. He stayed close, eyes on my face like my pain was something he would take if he could. And somehow, his fear made me feel less alone. Evan came to the private clinic with the nanny and waited with hot chocolate that he barely touched. When the baby finally arrived, small and furious and perfect, the sound of that first cry cracked something open in me that had been sealed tight for months. Damian's face changed when he saw the baby. The hard lines softened. The power didn't disappear, but it rearranged itself around something smaller and more sacred. When Evan was finally allowed in, he walked slowly, like he was approaching something fragile. His eyes filled up the moment he saw the baby in my arms. He reached out one finger and touched the baby's tiny hand, then looked up at me with a seriousness that didn't belong to 7-year-olds. I could read his thought without him saying it. We made it. We survived. Later, when the snow kept falling outside and the room smelled like warm blankets and antiseptic and newborn skin, I thought back to the beginning, the overheard rejection, the contract, the way my life had been treated like a deal. I'd believed I was unwanted. I'd believed Damian didn't want me. Now I understood something deeper. Sometimes rejection isn't absence of desire. Sometimes it's fear disguised as cruelty. Sometimes it's a man trying to protect himself from the very thing that could save him. Damian didn't become my salvation because he was a hero. He became my salvation because he chose truth when it mattered. He chose partnership over control. He chose to let me have a voice even when that voice changed him. And I didn't find freedom by running away from chaos. I found it by claiming my place inside it, by refusing to be a pawn, by protecting my children with both softness and steel, by demanding a love that didn't silence me. If this story hit you in the chest the way it hit me living it, tell me in the comments. What moment changed everything for you? The chase, the confession, the meeting, or the day I took command? And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.